what are the differences between the two parties? I mean, the real differences. I told you that I was watching the DNC with a friend years ago who was relatively new in the country. She was from Iran, and she had never seen a political convention before. And so we're watching one of them. I don't know whether it was DNC or RNC. She turns to me and she says, what's the difference between the Republican Party and the Democratic Party? You know, it's the kind of question that a child would ask, and no one really had ever asked me that before. And I wanted to give her a good, thorough answer, but not one that was so simplistic as to be meaningless. So I thought about it for a moment, and I said, well, Republicans believe hard work wins. Democrats believe the system is rigged. And I've thought about that answer for years, and I think it's a good one. It's broad, obviously. It's simplistic. But I think it captures the essence of the two parties. Democrats believe that it's the government's job to, quote, level the playing field and to deal with life's unfairness. Republicans recognize that life is unfair, but that whatever your circumstances, through hard work and perseverance, you can improve your circumstances. And those are two very different worldviews. The Democratic worldview requires one to assume the Constitution is a living, breathing document. Otherwise, they would not have the power to do the kinds of things that they want to do. Because the Constitution, like it or not, is a contract that limits the duties, powers, obligations of the federal government. Like FEMA, sorry, not there. Like Social Security, sorry, not there. Like Medicare, sorry, not there. Like Medicaid, sorry, not there. Like the Department of Education, sorry, there is no provision in the Constitution for a federal Department of Education. Now, that is what Republicans believe, at least on paper. Many of them are squishes and are perfectly happy with a much larger government than they ought to be happy with. But those are the basic differences. And Milton Friedman was a Republican and a Libertarian, died not long ago. And he went on the old Phil Donahue show during the days when heavy topics could be aired during the afternoon. And as you know, Phil Donahue is a lefty. And Milton Friedman very carefully explained to him the benefits of limited government, free trade, and capitalism.
Let me see if I can express in very imprecise terms and very briefly the core of your personal statement. We have too much government. We are not allowing the free enterprise system to work as your most favored historical figure, Adam Smith, suggested it would work if we just let things alone. We have too much government intervention. It is interrupting the not only the wonderful work that the invisible hand does if we leave it alone, but it's also depriving people of personal liberties.
Absolutely.
Okay.
That's a very good summary.
Fill in the blanks for me.
No, that's a very good summary. There is a very important role for government to play, but there's such a thing as too much of a good thing. And government has been growing beyond bounds. Right now, to take the simplest measure, the government spending at federal, state, and local levels amounts to over 40% of the income of the people of the country. If you go around and ask people, are you getting your money's worth for that 40% of your income which is being spent on your behalf, supposedly, by government, there are very few people who will say yes. And they are right. We're not getting our money's worth. Much of it is, it's not merely that it's being wasted. It's that it's being wasted in a very particular sense. You're spending money to do opposite things. Here at one place, we're spending our money to try to propagandize us not to smoke. In another place, we're spending our money to subsidize the growing of tobacco. Now, what sense does it make to spend two streams of money like that? And you can go over and over again and find exactly the same thing. The government is too big. It's too intrusive. It restricts what we can do. It's becoming our master instead of our servant, and we've got to react against it and cut it down to size.
That was Milton Friedman, the author, co-author, actually. His wife also helped to write the book. called Free to Choose. I mentioned the other day I was having a EKG, and the tech asked me what I did for a living, and I told him I was a talk show host. He said, what do you talk about? I said, politics. He said, what kind of politics? I said, you wouldn't like them. He said, what? I said, I'm a libertarian. He said, you mean like Milton Friedman? He had read Free to Choose. Not only had he read it, he also watched the series that was narrated by Arnold Schwarzenegger. By the way, that's why so many of us voted for Arnold Schwarzenegger. We assumed that he was a devotee of Milton Friedman because he did the narration of Free to Choose when it was released on PBS. Little did we know. Anyway, Milton Friedman further told Phil Donahue that good intentions are not good enough.
Nobody ever goes up to Congress and says, look, vote me a big bonanza of $100,000 because I'm a good man and I deserve $100,000 out of the public purse. No. He says you should subsidize X, Y, and Z because the poor middle-class Americans or the poor people in the slums will benefit from it, by it. So you have two classes of people, the so-called do-gooders. You have the honest, sincere people, and they invariably end up being the front men for private interests they would never knowingly support. That's part of Adam
What's an
Smith's
example
state.
of that?
An example of that are the 19th century Ralph Naders who got the Interstate Commerce Commission established. They got the Interstate Commerce Commission established supposedly to protect the consumer. No. The do-gooder reformers, the Ralph Nader types, were sincere. They were interested in promoting the interests of the consumers. And they were complaining that the railroads were monopolies and they were charging too high freight rates, and we had to get the government in order to eliminate that exploitation of the consumer. But who benefited from it? The ICC was set up. The do-gooder, well-meaning reformers went on to their next reform, and the railroads took over the ICC. And they used the ICC to keep out competition, to raise rates rather than lower them. They used it in the 1920s to get the control of ICC extended to trucking because that was the most dangerous source of competition. So those well-meaning reformers, not because they were bad people, but they ended up being the front men for special interests. And you have that over and over again.
He mentioned the Interstate Commerce Commission. That was set up, by the way, in 1887. Before that, there was no Interstate Commerce Commission. How did the country function without an ICC for all those years until in 1887, for the reasons that Milton Friedman mentioned had nothing to do with protecting consumers? How did they survive until that was set up? Obama often talks about NAFTA and GATT, quote, shipping jobs overseas. Here's what Milton Friedman told Phil Donahue about the importance of free trade.
Best protection of the consumer, the best offense against monopoly. Let me put it another way. There's an old saying, if you want to catch a thief, you set a thief to catch him. If you want to catch a businessman monopoly, you set another businessman to break it down. You don't send a government civil servant after him. The most effective anti-monopoly legislation you could possibly have would be free trade.
That is why it is so silly when people like Mitt Romney talk about trading with China, but going to make sure they trade fairly. If China wants to screw its own citizens by taking money to prop up failing businesses, all it means is that we get stuff on a subsidized basis. And we ought not stop it from them. We ought not stop their own stupidity. Milton Friedman also tried to explain to Phil Donahue the difference between a libertarian and an anarchist. And there are differences, you know.
I'm not an anarchist.
Okay.
I believe that government has a very important role, but it's a limited role.
Okay.
And because we've been trying to extend the role, we haven't been doing what government ought to do as well as it does, as it should. We've been doing a terrible job on what ought to be the first function of government. The first function of government is to protect the nation against foreign enemies and to protect individual citizens against assault by their fellow citizens. And we've been doing a terrible job on both ends.
And in that goal, you are aligned with John Stuart Mill.
Absolutely.
Not bad company, and I want to show you what I've taken out of your book. You've quoted Mill in
Good.
here.
I'm glad to see you've read to page 3.
I've tried two. Page 2, Doc. All right, let's... Here it is, John Stuart. The sole end for which mankind are warranted. This looks grammatically incorrect, but stay with us. Individually or collectively, in interfering with the liberty of action of any of their number is self-protection. The only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. And then, oh, okay. The only part of the conduct of anyone, I'm sorry, his own good, either physical or moral, is not a sufficient warrant. In other words, let's understand that. For my own good, the government cannot pass what would be called forcible action. In other words, here's the way a person ought to be able to kill themselves.
The right to commit suicide is a natural human right.
It's your life.
It's your life. Now,
and you don't want the government to spend any money to prevent you from doing that.
Absolutely not. Now, I am obviously, as a friend of yours, will try to prevent you. If you were a friend of mine and you suddenly got to a bridge and were going to jump over, I would certainly rush over and grab you and pull you up.
But you don't want public money to keep me from doing it.
Well, I would go farther. No, I want to go farther on a personal basis. I would reason with you. I would argue with you. But let's suppose after I had reasoned with you, after I had argued with you, I had failed to persuade you. Do I have the right to use force to prevent you from disposing of your own life? The clearest case of that, I certainly do not. I certainly do not. And you do not. And certainly, you do not have the right to put your hands in the pockets of other people in order to prevent somebody from doing something in his own value system.
That was Milton Friedman, the late, great Nobel laureate in economics, author of the book Free to Choose, among many books, explaining the philosophy of libertarianism. Limited government, maximum personal responsibility. Government's number one job is to protect us against enemies, foreign and domestic. And as you heard him say, we're doing a terrible job of doing that because we're doing so many other things.
Next Tuesday is election day. Next Tuesday, all of you will go to the polls, will stand there in the polling place and make a decision. I think when you make that decision, it might be well if you would ask yourself, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? Is it easier for you to go and buy things in the stores than it was 4 years ago? Is there more or less unemployment in the country than there was 4 years ago? And if you answer all of those questions yes, why then I think your choice is very obvious as to who you will vote for. If you don't agree, if you don't think that this course that we've been on for the last 4 years is what you would like to see us follow for the next 4, then I could suggest another choice that you have. I believe that there is a fundamental difference, and I think it has been evident in most of the answers that Mr. Carter has given tonight, that he seeks the solution to anything as another opportunity for a federal government program. I would like to have a crusade today, and I would like to lead that crusade with your help, and it would be one to take government off the backs of the great people of this country.
Only government can break the cycle that are crippling our economy.
I believe that there is a fundamental difference, and I think it has been evident in most of the answers that Mr. Carter has given tonight, that he seeks the solution to anything as another opportunity for a federal government program. I would like to have a crusade today, and I would like to lead that crusade with your help, and it would be one to take government off the backs of the great people of this country.
Only government can break the cycle that are crippling our economy.
Those last two sound bites tell you the difference between these two parties. And this is a real serious choice between a guy, President Obama, who believes it's government's job to take your and my money and invest it. It's government's job to create 3.5 million jobs. It's the government's job to create green jobs. It's the government's job to dictate to government motors that they ought to make the Chevy Volt, even though the Volt loses money for every one that it sells. It's the government's job to do all of this stuff. The scary thing is half the country believes it is the government's job to do all of that. And that is why Obama, despite the fact that I believe he's going to be beaten and be beaten badly, is still pretty much neck and neck with Mitt Romney in the polls. These 8 to 10 or so swing states, they're not going to break for Obama this time. How can they? How can the young people who can't find jobs go to that polling booth with the same level of enthusiasm that they did 4 years ago. Remember that woman who said he's going to put gas in my car, help me pay my rent? None of that, of course, is going to happen. If anything, it's harder for you to put gas in your car, harder for you to pay your rent as a result of the last several years, in part because of Obama's disastrous economic policies.